right, welcome to the second part of our lecture on democracies in the 1920s. We're going to pick up right where we left off in class today. France and the specific economic problems that they were facing. It's important to keep in mind that they were very similar to what Germany had to deal with because of the devastation of World War I. There was a lot of people who had died, they had acquired a lot of debt, and so as a result, this is going to create economic chaos and political unrest. And so throughout the 1920s, the government too is going to create a multi-party system, very similar to what we discussed in Germany. But it's mainly going to be dominated by the conservatives because they wanted to support just basically how life was commonly lived, supporting the status quo, supporting businesses so that their economy could recover, and of course, a strong military and a strong church. Those are the characteristics of a strong conservative government. In 1926, Raymond Poincaré, he's the one who's going to be recalled to office as the leader of France. And in fact, it was actually very successful because he was able to slash spending, he raised taxes, and so confidence in the economy was raised. And France actually did pretty well for itself during this time of turmoil, except, of course, when the Great Depression hits. But for the most part, they were on the road to recovery. Talk about Great Britain. And the difference with them is that they were going to try, even when they were fighting in war, to go more towards that social equality, trying to maintain that social harmony that Great Britain was always known for. Remember, they were a very liberal country. They were constantly looking at reform to try to increase universal suffrage. That was something we discussed when we went over the mass politics situation. And so the way that they did this after World War I, specifically in 1928, was the Representation of the People's Act, where women over the age of 21 had the right to vote. Before that, women over 30 were given the right to vote in 1918, but 10 years later you can see that they lowered the age. So that's one way that they continued. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the concentration of wealth is definitely going to be more geared towards the top than any other country. So they still had that social differences from the social classes. For example, the top 1% actually owned up to 2/3 of the national wealth. So you still have that huge gap between the rich and the poor, especially in Great Britain. They are going to suffer a lot, though, from unemployment. About 12%, their unemployment rate was up to 12%. And the reason for that is because they had a very difficult time recovering the economic losses that they suffered during World War I, just like many of the countries in Europe. And so in 1926, there was this huge strike called the General Strike. And the reason that this took place is because the miners, or those that worked in the coal mines, were afraid that there was going to be a drop in their wages. And so the strike did fail, but the government decided then after that to outlaw any labor strikes that took place in 1927 to try to prevent future unemployment. I mean, unemployment was already bad, and now people aren't going to work. You can see why the government. They are going to continue to try to grow in their social welfare, though. That is one of the things that Great Britain was mostly known for. And so they did that by providing unemployment benefits, subsidized housing, medical aid, and increasing old age pensions. So despite the fact that they suffered from unemployment, financially, they're still going to try to help the poor as much as possible, especially because of that huge gap. Politically, it's concerned, a new governmental party is going to rise as a champion of the working classes, and this is known as the Labor Party. And they're mainly going to fight for more social equality, and they actually do take power in Parliament. Conservatives eventually do regain power, and they regain the majority in Parliament, because what they did is they took the Labor Party and they threw them under the bus and basically said that they were pro-communist. And so when the Soviet Union was formed after the Russian Revolution in World War I, communism is going to become a huge threat. And so if you if you claim that anybody's communist, it becomes like a huge issue, and that's eventually what the Conservatives did with the Labor Party, and that's how they got their power back. They're going to be under the control of Stanley Baldwin, and they rule in Parliament between 1924 and 1929. But they do tend to be very compromising when it came to different social issues like female voting, pensions for widows and orphans and the elderly. So even though they were conservative, they understood the importance and the need for reforms. Okay, another thing we need to discuss that we're kind of revisiting back from when we talked about mass politics was the Irish question. Remember, the Irish wanted to seek their independence, especially because most Irish were Catholic and they were fighting with the Northern Protestants. And so one of the things we talked about when we discussed World War I was the Easter Rebellion, when a specific faction known as the Sinn Féin, they're starting to gain more and more prominence in Ireland, and many, many people died because the British government did not give Ireland the independence that it was promised because they were distracted by the war. And so this is going to prompt a civil war within Ireland between the IRA and the Black and Tan, which was England's special forces. So even though the rest of the world was at war, and so finally, after the war in 1921, London created the Irish Free State, which, remember, that northern part of Ireland, also known as the Ulster, they're going to become part of the British Commonwealth, or Northern Ireland, and then Ireland itself becomes its own independent country. And that took place in 1922, where they were granted full autonomy, basically because Britain couldn't stop the bitter guerrilla war, the civil war that was taking place. So officially, Ireland becomes an independent country in 1922. Something to keep in mind. So another thing that England is going to deal with at this time is the fact that remember, the sun never sets on the British Empire, so they're going to start to loosen some of their ties with their empires around the world. For example, they ended their protectorate in Egypt. Of course, they're still going to control the Suez Canal, but they're no longer a protectorate of Egypt. And then different equality was granted in dominions such as Canada and also Australia. So kind of loosening their ties on these particular areas, letting them have more autonomy. Okay, so that's it for France and Britain. Now we're going to completely switch gears here and talk about one of the main and most important events of the 1920s, or the interwar years, and that is the Great Depression. We already discussed some of the economic problems that each of these countries was dealing with, but it's going to get significantly worse because of what is known as the Great Depression. Now, a lot of times we connect that with the United States, but it's called the Great Depression because it's going to affect every country. So let's talk about, first of all, why it happened. What are the causes of this event? Well, number one, the debt that these countries were dealing with after World War I, but then also world trade had a lot to do with it because every single country decided that they were going to raise their tariffs. And the reason for that is because of overproduction, especially in the United States. They were overproducing goods. The United States in 1930 tried to fix things by instituting a tariff, which is called the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And a tariff is basically a tax on imports. And so, unfortunately, this backfired because then 23 other countries also did the same exact thing, which ultimately made world trade drop by 35%. And so, this is like a domino effect. And at this point, people are relying on each other for goods, and this is just going to cause people to go deeper and deeper into debt. And then in 1931, Britain went off of the gold standard, and 20 other countries are going to follow suit after that. When you go off of the gold standard, it hurts you economically because you have nothing to back up your money. The ultimate, or the spark, I guess you could say, that really caused the Great Depression is when the stock market crashed in 1929 in the United States. And so this is what caused the Great Depression to happen in the US, but then it spread worldwide because so many countries were relying on each other for products. Actually, America was considered the workshop of the world at this particular time. So because so many people were dependent on American investment capital, this leads to the collapse, financial collapse, when the United States cut off capital flows to Europe. So they couldn't afford to help themselves. How are they going to help other countries as well? And so what bankers started doing was taking back their loans that they had made to these European countries. And so that just completely put this economic crisis into a the long-term problems that came from this, obviously the United States goes into a very long depression. The international economy weakens. You start to have this overproduction of goods because nobody can afford to buy anything. The banks are closing because they become very unstable. Industries that used to be powerful industries are now weak, and over half of Americans in the early 1930s were living below the poverty line. So many people were affected by this. How did it affect Europe? Well, we already know about the age of anxiety. So socially, we see how that's affecting families, how that's affecting art, how that's affecting culture. And so there was just a slight bit of optimism that was given by the political leaders in the 1920s. That's why it's called the Roaring Twenties. Not only financially, but politically, things were looking really good. But that's now completely shattered because the politicians can't save anybody from the economic problems. Every single country is going to have a decline in production. The only one that's really not going to be affected by this that much is Russia. And that's because the government controlled the economy, not capitalism. And so they had what's known as a command economy, or as we know, communism. And so they're not going to be that affected by it. But unemployment is going to hit every. So how are we going to fix it? Well, the United States is going to take the lead on this with Roosevelt's New Deal, and he's going to try to completely reform capitalism. Really, this is when we start to create more of what's known as a mixed economy. In other words, increasing government intervention. And so you're going to learn all about the details of the New Deal next year, so I'm not really going to go into great detail about it now, but he's going to help try to fix the unemployment issue, try to help the poor a little bit more. So leaning actually more towards a socialist type government than 100% capitalist. And other European countries are going to be influenced by Roosevelt's New Deal because the U.S. then was able to reinstate some of their loans. And they're also going to learn from the United States' example of trying to fix the economy. Scandinavia, not countries we talk about that much, they actually were the most successful in responding to the Depression because they already were socialist, and so they were able to fix the problems. And they're going to be one of the least ones hit during this time period. The British, they take the approach of what's called an orthodox economic theory. They, by abandoning the gold standard, completely reorganizing their industry, increasing tariffs, reforming finances, cutting government spending, and balancing the budget, they figured out a way to make it work. And so just sitting down, hunkering down, looking at the book, so to speak, and putting a plan in place. And they were able to recover fairly quickly, but they did have one of the lowest unemployment rates, even though it still was pretty high, or relatively high. After 1932, we can say that the economy recovered considerably. So even though the stock market crash took place in 1929, and after that, believe it or not, the years in the 1930s are considered to be better than in the 20s, especially in Europe, as they move further and further away from World War I, and everybody's focusing on this recovery. And just like the United States, Britain is going to come out of the Depression permanently and not enter into another one because of their rearmament for World War II. And so you're probably wondering, how does that help them economically? Well, what it means is it gave people jobs. And so by building up their military, they had people, changing the unemployment issue. And then when people are making money, they're spending money. France, immediately they're not really going to feel the impact of the Great Depression, and that's because they were so industrialized, so they were able to, that's because they weren't as industrialized as Britain, Germany, and the United States. They were still more of an agricultural society, but they did have to deal with overproduction. And also it's going to increase class tensions. In other words, tensions between the upper class and the middle class and the lower class. And so a new way of thought from a political standpoint is going to emerge, or a radical right that's going to support government reorganization more along fascist lines. So we can see a time period when France even almost falls under a fascist regime. That is prevented, but as we can see, they're just affected a little bit differently than the other countries. But they create something known as the Popular Front. And because fascism was now a threat, there was going to be a coalition, or kind of like a gang, I guess you could say, of Republicans, socialists, communists, and radicals that are going to be led by someone by the name of Leon Blum, to try to really combat this fascist threat that's coming up. Because fascism was a very extreme way to try to solve a country that was in crisis, but France didn't want to fall to that idea. Instead, they're going to come up with their own New Deal inspired by the United States. Leon Blum really encouraged a union movement, and launched a far-reaching program of social reform, including paid vacations, a 40-hour work week. So he's definitely going to try to make these changes, but unfortunately, so because of these divisions, especially over what's going to take place in the Spanish Civil War, and we will talk about that a little bit later, the Popular Front ultimately didn't last. It was destroyed in 1936. And so France is going to continue to remain politically divided, even though Germany itself is going to start to recover in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler. So this wraps up the democracies and a little bit of the Great Depression. So some interesting facts that took place between 1920 and about 1938 or so. It's important that you keep these points in mind in case you have a question on this, so that you can use these names, you can use these examples of evidence of what was taking place in Europe during this time period. Thank you for your attention. Make sure I get your, I've gotten